This is Slat 8 in our Progressivism unit, Taft at home and abroad. We talked in our last slide there about the fact that Taft was Roosevelt's hand-picked successor because Roosevelt believed he would continue a lot of the work that he had begun. Oops. Mistake. We're going to see some problems here, and let's talk about them. Okay? Taft was a very likable guy, the jolly old fat man. And if I haven't already, somebody remind me to tell you all about Taft's greatest legacy, if you want to call it that, in the White House. So you'll enjoy that. Anyway, Taft was the sort of the jolly old fat man. Everybody liked. He had a great personality, but he wasn't a particularly good politician. Right? He'd not been elected to anything. He was trained as a lawyer and a judge. He'd been appointed Secretary of War by Roosevelt, so he hadn't been really elected to anything. He hadn't had to campaign for anything. So he didn't really know how to kind of work a room, if you want to call it that. He didn't know how to convince people to do what he wanted them to do. He was a very poor judge of public opinion, so he often came down on the wrong side of an issue, got people angry with him. He had very little stomach for a fight, didn't like conflict. So he was really, Roosevelt hoped he would continue his progressive reforms, but Taft very much just preferred the status quo. Just keep things going along as they are and don't worry about change. But in a country that is in the midst of progressive changes, that's not what you need. So Taft does not continue a lot of the work that Roosevelt started. And in fact, over his 4 years, will actually undo a lot of things that Roosevelt had gotten done. Okay? One of the things we do need to talk about here with Taft is his foreign policy. Okay? Whereas Roosevelt, again, sort of, always looked for a fight to get into the middle of, Taft doesn't. Taft is going to use American investment to replace the American military. It's called dollar diplomacy. And Taft will encourage Wall Street to invest dollars into areas that the United States had an interest in, especially Central America. So if you look at the map here at the bottom of the page, this is where U.S. dollars were invested. Business invested in Mexico, in the Caribbean, in South America, Canada obviously, but the bigger the circle, the more money invested there. The thinking is that countries that do business with each other tend to not go to war with each other. So dollar diplomacy, kind of replacing bullets with dollars here, using U.S. investment as a foreign policy. Okay? It actually works pretty well. We do a lot of business. U.S. companies make a lot of money in Central and South America, or just Latin America in general. Okay? Let's talk about trust busting. Okay? Roosevelt was the great trust buster. But really, Roosevelt gets that nickname simply because he's the first trust buster. No other president had gone after trust until Roosevelt, so he's called the Great Trust Buster. If you actually look at the numbers, Taft was a lot bigger trust buster than Roosevelt was. In 7.5 years in office, Roosevelt brings 44 lawsuits against trusts and monopolies. 44 in 7.5 years. Taft brought 90 lawsuits in only 4 years. He goes after 90 different companies. Now, that could be that Taft, again, was trained as a lawyer, so lawsuits are sort of his first reaction here, gut instinct. What do? We file a lawsuit. Two of them in particular In 1911, Standard Oil, Rockefeller's big company, will finally be broken up by the U.S. government. Ida Tarbell, the woman whose father was driven out of business, finally gets her revenge as Standard Oil is broken up and Rockefeller is forced to sell off parts of his company so that there can be competition. But really, the bigger one here for our purposes is U.S. Steel. Okay, this is J.P. Morgan. Carnegie, remember, sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan, turned it into U.S. Steel. He bought up more and more and more companies until really he has the steel monopoly in the country, and that's the logo you see down there in the right-hand corner of the USS. That's U.S. Steel. In 1911, Taft also goes after U.S. Steel. Now, this really infuriates Roosevelt because Roosevelt had personally helped organize several of the mergers of U.S. Steel that made it so powerful. So Roosevelt sort of saw U.S. Steel as the poster child here of, the quality monopoly, that not all monopolies are bad. U.S. Steel and Standard Oil both provided quality products at a fair price. So Roosevelt didn't see why they had to be attacked, but Taft goes after them and wins in court. So Standard Oil and U.S. Steel will both be broken up by Taft, the real kind of trust buster here.